And so the Huns, passing through the lands of the Alans, who bordered the Grev tongues and were commonly called Tanai, subjected them to terrible extermination and devastation. And with the survivors, they formed an alliance and joined them to themselves. With their participation, they unexpectedly and boldly invaded the vast and fertile lands of Ermenrich, a warlike ruler whom the neighboring peoples greatly feared because of his many different military exploits. Struck by the power of this sudden storm, Ermenrich tried for a long time to put up a decisive resistance and save himself from them. But as rumors increasingly intensified the horror of the impending disasters, he put an end to his fear of the impending great misfortunes by committing suicide. Vitamir, who was elected king after his death, resisted the Alans for some time, relying on another Hun tribe, which he had attracted in exchange for payment. But after suffering many military losses, he fell in battle, defeated by the power of weapons. On behalf of his young son, Vitarich, Alati and Safrax took over the government, experienced leaders known for their fortitude. But the difficult circumstances broke them too, and having lost hope of salvation, they prudently retreated and crossed the Danubius, Dniester, river, which flows through the vast ravine between Ister and Borysthenes, Dnieper. When rumors of these unexpected events reached Atheneric, the ruler of the Terwingi, against whom, as I've already mentioned, Valens had recently undertaken a campaign to punish him for his assistance to Procopius, he attempted to resist by deploying his entire army, in case he was attacked, as the others had been. He set up a large camp on the banks of the Danube in a convenient location near the Grevtungens, and at the same time sent Mundrich, who later became commander of the border with Arabia, 20 miles ahead together with Legariman and other elders, whom he ordered to watch for the approach of the enemy, while he calmly prepared for battle. But things did not turn out quite as he had calculated. The Huns, with their characteristic insight, suspected that his main forces were somewhere behind. They surrounded those they saw in front, and when they lay down peacefully in the moonlight shining through the darkness of the night, they crossed the river at a ford and chose the best course of action. Fearing that the front guard would warn those further back, they stormed Atheneric. Stunned by the first blow, Atheneric lost some of his men and was forced to seek refuge in the nearby high mountains. Surprised and even more fearful of the future, he secretly began to build a high wall from the banks of the Straz, Prut, river to the Danube River and the lands of the Tafels. He assumed that by quickly building this protective cover, it would provide him with complete safety and peace of mind. While the work was being done at an extreme pace, the Huns harassed him with a rapid advance and could have completely destroyed him if they had not stopped their advance due to the difficulties they encountered as a result of their abundant loot. Meanwhile, rumors spread widely among the other Gothic tribes that a previously unknown people had risen from the other end of the earth, like a snowstorm on the high peaks, destroying everything in their path. A large part of the people who had left Atheneric due to food shortages began to look for a place to live far away from any rumors about the barbarians. After a long discussion about where to settle, they decided that Thrace was the most suitable refuge for them. Two considerations spoke in favor of this choice. First, that this country had the richest pastures, and second, that it was separated by the powerful current of the Ister from the regions exposed to the thunderbolts of the foreign Mars. The same decision was adopted by the rest, as if at a general assembly. And so, led by their chieftain Alaviv, they went to the banks of the Danube and sent messengers to Valens with a humble request to accept them. They promised that they would behave properly and provide auxiliary troops if necessary. While this was happening, terrible rumors came from beyond the borders of the empire that new shifts of unusual magnitude were taking place among the northern peoples. Rumor had it that throughout the entire region from the Marcomanni and Quadi to Pontus itself, numerous unknown barbarian peoples, driven from their homes by sudden pressure, had gathered near the Ister with their wives and children. Initially, this news was received with disdain by our people, due to the fact that in these regions, because of their remoteness from a theater of war, they were accustomed to hearing reports that the wars had either ended or subsided over time. But when the situation began to become clear, and the rumors were confirmed by the arrival of a delegation of barbarians, who insistently begged for their homeless people to be accepted on the right bank of the river, they accepted this with more joy than fear. Experienced liars praised the emperor's luck, who unexpectedly received so many recruits from distant lands that he was able to assemble an invincible army by uniting his own and foreign forces, so that the state treasury would receive huge revenues from military acquisitions, which were paid annually by the provinces. With this hope, various officials were sent to prepare for the transfer of the hordes of savages. Detailed measures were taken to ensure that none of the future destroyers of the Roman state would be forgotten, even if they were struck by a terminal illness. After receiving permission from the emperor to cross the Danube and settle in certain places in Thrace, they began to transfer in crowds day and night by ships and boats carved from tree trunks. And since this river is the most dangerous of all and its water level was higher than normal due to frequent rainfall, many people drowned, both those who, due to the overcrowding of the vessels, sailed very confidently against the current, and those who jumped in to swim. Thus, they made every effort to destroy the Roman world. It was well known that the unfortunate authors of the transfer of the barbarians often tried to determine their numbers, but after many unsuccessful attempts, they abandoned this. They explained this with the words of the poet, "Whoever wanted to know this, he might as well have counted the grains of sand in the Libyan desert that the wind blows away." Let us recall the ancient accounts of the attack of the Median hordes on Greece. Crossing the Hellespont, they tried to make a passage by skillfully destroying the rocks. And then, at Dorisk, they were counted not individually, but in piles which posterity considers to be a fairy tale. But after the countless hordes of barbarians scattered throughout the provinces and spread across the wide world, taking over all the localities and seizing all the mountain ridges, this event of the new era confirmed the veracity of the ancient report. And the first to be accepted were Alaviv and Fritigern, to whom the emperors ordered that provisions and land for cultivation be given. At that time, when the gates of our border were open and the barbarians threw armed men against us, just as Etna spews its hot ashes, and in its difficult situation the state needed commanders renowned for their military successes, it was then, as if by the intervention of an angry god, that men with tarnished names stood at the head of the armies. First were Lupicinus and Maximus, the former a count in Thrace, the latter a commander who aroused hatred, both of them rivaling each other in folly. While the barbarians, brought to our lands, were starving, these disgraced commanders introduced a shameful auction. For every dog, as their greed dictated, they took one slave, and among them were even children of elders. Meanwhile, Vitric, king of the Grev tongues, approached the shores of the Ister, together with Alati and Saphric, who were his guardians, Sizo and Farnobius. The king urgently sent an embassy and asked the emperor to be welcomed warmly. The envoys received a refusal, which was justified by state interests. Now, the Grevtungians found themselves in an alarming state of indecision, wondering what to do. Athanaric, fearing that he would receive the same refusal, retreated to remote areas. He remembered that he had once treated Valens with contempt, forcing the emperor to sign the peace treaty in the middle of the river, explaining that his oath forbade him from setting foot on Roman soil. Fearing that this mockery was still remembered, he returned with all his people to the region of Caucasia, an inaccessible area due to its high, tree-covered mountains, from where he had driven out the Sarmatians. The Terwingi, who had been accepted into the empire at that time, were still wandering along the banks of the Danube, oppressed by the double hardship of their commander's treacherous behavior, that they had received no provisions and that they were still restrained because of the shameful treaties. When they found out about this, they began to say that they would take measures to prevent the disaster caused by betrayal. And Lupicin, fearing a revolt, set out with his military forces against them and urged them to come out to meet him. The Grev tongues took advantage of this opportune moment. They noticed that the soldiers were busy elsewhere and that the boats floating between the two banks, which had prevented them from crossing the river, were now idle. They quickly rigged up some boats, crossed the river, and set up camp not far from Fritigern. Fritigern, with his characteristic foresight, tried to secure himself for the future for every possible eventuality, to show obedience to the emperor and to remain in alliance with the powerful kings. He slowly moved forward and, after a short march, approached Marcianopolis. But another event occurred here that ignited the torch of the furnaces, fueling the demise of the empire. Lipicinus invited Alaviv and Fritigern to a feast. He kept the barbarian hordes far from the walls of the city, placing armed patrols in front of them, even though they persistently begged to be allowed into the city to buy food, arguing that they were now subject to Roman rule and were peaceful people. A great commotion arose between the citizens and the barbarians, and it came to a fight. The enraged barbarians, realizing that several of their compatriots had been detained, dispersed the detachment of soldiers and collected their dead. Lipicinus was informed of what had happened at a moment when he was feasting at a sumptuous table and enjoying boisterous merriment, already drunk and sleepy. As soon as he was able to think about what awaited him, he ordered the execution of all the armed men who, as honor guards and bodyguards of their leaders, had lined up in front of the palace. Then the Goths, who had surrounded the city walls, were outraged by what had happened, advanced, and with angry cries threatened to take revenge, thinking that their kings had been captured. The cunning Fritigern realized that there was a danger of them being held hostage along with the others, and shouted that the situation was taking a dangerous turn if he and his friends were not allowed to go out and calm the people who had rebelled, assuming that their leaders had been killed under the pretext of a friendly feast. After receiving permission, they all went out and were greeted solemnly with shouts of joy. They jumped on their horses and galloped off, determined to prepare for widespread war. When rumor, the harmful nurturer of gossip, spread the news of this, the entire Tervingi people became excited about war. Amidst the many ominous omens of great dangers to come, they raised their banners as was their custom, sounded terrifying signals with trumpets, and began to roam around in raiding parties, plundering and burning the local population and wreaking terrible havoc wherever they could. Lipicinus hastily gathered his army and advanced against them, acting according to the situation without a plan. 9 miles from the city, he stopped to prepare for battle. Seeing this, the barbarians rushed upon our disorderly troops and, clutching their shields to their chests, stabbed with spears and swords everyone they encountered on their way. In the fierce and bloody battle, a large part of the soldiers fell, the banners were lost, and the officers were killed, with the exception of the unfortunate commander, who, while the others were fighting, thought only of how to save himself by fleeing and galloped back to the city. After that, the enemies dressed in Roman armor and continued to roam around without encountering any resistance. Hordes of nomadic peoples crossed the Bosporus in 2,000 ships, passed along the shores of Propontis, and caused terrible devastation by land and sea. But when they lost a large part of their forces, they turned back. In the battles, the emperors Decius, father and son, were killed by the barbarians. The city of Pamphylia was besieged, many islands were devastated, the whole of Macedonia was burned, and Thessaloniki was under siege for a long time, as was Cyzicus. Anchialus was captured, as was Nicopolis, built by Emperor Trajan in honor of his victory over the Dacians. After many cruel defeats on both sides, Philippopolis was also destroyed, and if history is to be believed, 100,000 people were killed within the city walls. The invading enemies roamed freely through Epirus, Thessaly, and all of Greece. Supreme power was handed over to the glorious General Claudius, but he died a hero's death, and only Aurelian, a capable man and a strict avenger of evil deeds, managed to drive them away. After that, for quite a long time, the barbarians behaved calmly and did nothing, except that sometimes their raiding parties made destructive incursions into neighboring areas. But I will continue my account from where I left off. Then, when the news spread everywhere about these events, the Gothic princes Sferid and Colia who had been accepted together with their compatriots long before and had received permission to spend the winter in Adrianople, treated everything that was happening with complete indifference, putting their own safety above all else. Unexpectedly, they received an imperial order to go to Hellespont. Without any hesitation, they asked to be given money for the journey and supplies, with permission for a 2-day delay. The commandant of the city, who was angry with them for robbing his suburban estate, took their request as a hostile act and armed the entire populace and craftsmen, of whom there were many, to exterminate them. He ordered the trumpeters to sound the battle signals and threatened everyone with death if they did not leave immediately, as commanded. Surprised by this unexpected turn of events, and threatened by the citizens, who had risen up more suddenly than deliberately, the Goths stood their ground. They were showered with insults, and the crowd beat them and shot arrows at them. And, angered by all this, they rose up in open rebellion. They killed many of those who had boldly attacked them, put the rest to flight, and captured various weapons. They then armed themselves with the Roman weapons they had taken from the dead, and when Fritigern arrived, they attached themselves to him as subordinate allies. Then they laid siege to the city. For a long time, they tried this difficult task, attacking here and there, some performing feats of bravery and dying unavenged by arrows and stones thrown with slings. Then Fritigern, seeing that they could not besiege it and were suffering great losses in vain, advised them to withdraw without completing the task, leaving a large detachment nearby. He argued that by leaving the fortress alone, they could plunder the rich areas around it without exposing themselves to any danger, since there were no defenders. After approving the plan of Perea, whom they considered to be very enterprising in his thinking, they scattered along the entire coast of Thrace and advanced cautiously, while the Romans who had betrayed them, their fellow countrymen or captives, directed them to rich settlements where they could find abundant booty. Not taking into account the hostile audacity, a great help to them was the daily joining of many of their compatriots who had been sold into slavery by merchants and those who, from the first days of their entry into Roman lands, tormented by hunger, sold themselves for a sip of wine or a pitiful piece of bread. They were joined by many miners from the gold mines who could not bear the heavy taxes. They were accepted by unanimous consent and contributed greatly to those wandering in unfamiliar places, pointing out hidden grain stores, hiding places for people, and shelters. Only the most remote places, or those far away, remained untouched by the invaders. They killed without regard to gender or age and burned everything in their path. They tore babies from their mothers' breasts and killed them, took the mothers captive, raped the widows, and in front of their eyes slaughtered their husbands, dragged children and young men over the corpses of their fathers, as well as many old men who cried out that they had lived long enough in this world. They robbed their property and beautiful women, tied their hands behind their backs, and without allowing them to mourn the ashes of their native homes, took them abroad. The ruler Valens was very worried about the news from Thrace, where many riots had broken out. He immediately sent Victor, the master of cavalry, to Persia to conclude a treaty for Armenia in view of the current difficulties. He himself decided to leave Antioch immediately and set off for Constantinople. He sent Perfuder and Trajan ahead, both of whom had a high opinion of themselves, but were not fit for war. After arriving at their destination, where their task was to wear down the barbarians' forces in small battles and ambushes, they adopted an inappropriate and dangerous plan. They decided to oppose the scattered, wild, and brave barbarians with the legions brought from Armenia, which, although they had been tested more than once in difficult battles, could not compare to the forces of the countless hordes of barbarians who had seized the peaks of the high mountains and plains. These legions had not yet experienced what unbridled fury combined with desperation could accomplish. Having pushed the enemy back behind the steep slopes of Hemus, they captured the major mountain passes to cut off any escape route for the barbarians, defeat them by siege, and wait for their leader Frigeric, who was approaching with Pannonian and Transalpine auxiliary forces. At Valens' request, Gratian ordered him to set out on a campaign to help those in need who were in great danger. After them, Ricomer, currently the commander of the domestic troops, also hurried to Thrace, having set out from Gaul on Gratian's orders. He brought with him several cohorts, which were probably only called that because most of them had deserted on the advice of Meribod, who, according to rumors, feared that Gaul, left unguarded, would be attacked from across the Rhine. Since Frigeric was delayed by gout, or as rumors spread by his malicious detractors would have it, he took advantage of his illness as an excuse not to participate in the brutal slaughter. So Ricomer unanimously accepted the command and joined Perfutor and Trajan, who were stationed near the city of Cilicium. Not far from this place, countless hordes of barbarians, who had surrounded themselves with a huge number of carts, stood as if behind a wall and enjoyed their rich booty in complete peace. So, hoping for a change for the better, the Roman leaders, ready to show off their bravery if they got the chance, kept a close eye on what the Goths were doing. They had a plan. If the Goths moved to another place, which happened very often, they would attack them from behind, confident that they would be able to kill many people and take much of their loot. Having learned of this, or received information from fugitives, thanks to whom nothing remained a secret, the barbarians remained in that place for a long time. They were not afraid of the opposing army, which, as they assumed, had been reinforced with new troops. Therefore, they practiced their characteristic habit of sending raiding parties in all directions, who, at the call of their elders, who were like flaming arrows, returned as quickly as birds in flight to the camp of carts, as they called it, and passed on the flame to their fellow tribesmen for a more important cause. Now, both sides were in a state of defensive tension, which subsided only temporarily. When those who had left the camp out of extreme necessity returned, the whole crowd, crowded into the camp's fences, was still raging with wild excitement and eager to experience the extreme dangers, to which even the tribal chiefs present did not object. But since the sun was already setting and the approaching night restrained them from their impulse and, to their chagrin, forced them to rest, they ate in their free time but did not sleep during the night. The Romans, having learned of this, could not sleep at all. The enemy and the demons of their leaders aroused their fear, as in wild animals. The outcome of the battle was uncertain, because the number of Romans was smaller, but they hoped that because of their just cause, they fearlessly expected that it would be favorable for them. As soon as the new day dawned, trumpet signals sounded on both sides to signal the start of the battle. The barbarians, having sworn an oath according to their custom, tried to occupy the hilly places so that they could rush down the slopes with great force against the enemy, like a rolling wheel. Seeing this, our soldiers rushed to their respective companies, fell into formation, and everyone, without anyone remaining on the sidelines, without stepping forward or leaving their place in formation. And so, when the battle lines of both sides, advancing cautiously forward, stopped motionless in place, the fighters looked at each other, casting malicious and cruel glances. The Romans raised a battle cry in their ranks, which grew louder and louder. In the barbarian language, it was called Berit, and thus they gave themselves courage and more strength. The barbarians, with their rough voices, praised the glory of their ancestors, and amid this din of different voices, light skirmishes broke out. And so, after they began shooting at each other with javelins and arrows, the enemies rushed into a fierce hand-to-hand battle. Joining their shields together in the shape of a turtle, they stood toe-to-toe with the enemy. The barbarians, light and agile in their formation, threw our huge red-hot clubs, cut the most stubborn resistors in the chest with knives, and broke through the left wing. A strong reserve unit rushed bravely from a nearby location and provided assistance at the moment when death was already looming behind the soldiers. The battle became increasingly bloody. The men threw themselves more bravely into the crowd, meeting swords and a hail of flying arrows. Here and there they pursued the fleeing, cutting them down with powerful blows from behind and in the back, in other places cutting the tendons behind the knees of those who had fallen, frozen with fear. The entire battlefield was covered with dead bodies. Among them lay the half-dead, vainly hoping to survive, some struck by lead from slingshots, others by iron-tipped arrows, some with their heads cut in half, and both halves hanging down their shoulders, a terrible sight. Still not tired of the fierce battle, the two sides attacked each other with equal chances. The strength of the body did not give way as long as it was vigorously excited by the spirit. The approaching evening ended the deadly battle. Without observing any order, everyone moved away as best they could, and the survivors returned gloomily to their tents. Some of the fallen high-ranking officials were buried, as far as the conditions of the place and time allowed. Birds of prey, accustomed to feeding on corpses, ate the bodies of the rest, as evidenced by the bones still visible in the fields. However, it became known that the Romans, although significantly outnumbered by the countless hordes of barbarians they were fighting, suffered a heavy blow, but also inflicted heavy losses on the barbarians. After this sad outcome of the battle, our people withdrew to nearby Marcianopolis. The Goths, without any external coercion, shut themselves up in their camp for 7 days and did not dare to leave or show themselves from there. Therefore, our army, taking advantage of the opportunity, besieged other barbarian bands in the narrows of the Hemus Mountains, erecting high earthen ramparts. They counted on the fact that the huge hordes of these harmful enemies, being enclosed between the Ister and the mountain wilderness, and finding no way out, would die of hunger since all food supplies were locked up in the fortified cities, none of which they attempted to besiege due to their inexperience in this matter. After that, Richomer returned to Gaul to bring help from there for the even more terrible military actions that were expected. All this happened in the 4th part of the year of the consulate of Gratian and Meribod, already towards autumn. Incidentally, Valens, having learned of the sad outcome of the battle and the looting, sent Saturninus, who was at that time master of the cavalry, to help Profuturus and Trajan. In those days, in the regions of Scythia and Moesia, where everything that could serve as food had been destroyed, the barbarians, enraged by their fury and hunger, strained all their forces to break through. After several attempts, repelled by the strong resistance of our troops, who were stationed on high ground, they found themselves in an extremely difficult situation and called for help from Hunnic and Alanic troops, tempting them with the hope of enormous spoils. When Saturninus learned of this, he had already arrived and set up posts and patrols, gradually gathering his forces and preparing to retreat. This was a reasonable plan, because he feared that the barbarians, like a river bursting its banks, would sweep away all the carefully guarded dangerous places without much difficulty. When the passes were cleared and our troops withdrew in time, the barbarians everywhere, wherever they could, began new atrocities. They spread out with impunity to plunder the entire plain of Thrace, starting with the lands washed by the Ister to the Rhodopes and the strait between the two great seas. Everywhere they committed murders, bloodshed, fires, and all kinds of violence against free people. Here, one could witness pitiful scenes that were terrible to behold. They chased women, including pregnant women, who were overcome with fear, with whips, and before they could free themselves from their burden, they suffered all kinds of violence. Small children clung to their mothers, listening to the moans of adolescents and girls of noble birth, taken captive with their hands tied behind their backs. Behind them were chased older girls and married women with faces contorted with crying, who were ready to prefer death, even the most cruel, to shame. They chased like wild beasts those born in freedom, who until recently had been rich and free, and now poured out their complaints to you, fate, for your cruelty and blindness. In an instant, a man is deprived of his property, his beloved family, his home, which before his eyes falls into ashes and ruins, and you hand him over to the savage victor, to torment or slavery and suffering. Like wild beasts that had broken out of their cages, the barbarians scattered over a vast area and approached the city of Dibaltum, where they encountered Barzimer, tribune of the Scutarii, and his men, the cornuti, and other infantry units as he was setting up camp. He was a seasoned and experienced commander in battle. Immediately, as was necessary, he ordered the battle signals to be sounded, strengthened his flanks, and set off for battle with his brave warriors. He defended himself manfully against the enemy, and the battle might have turned out well for him if the cavalry, which outnumbered them all, had not defeated him when he was finally exhausted. And so he died, killing many barbarians, whose losses were insignificant given their countless numbers. After these successes, the Goths, not knowing what to do next, began to search for Frigeric, seeing him as a powerful enemy, with the aim of destroying him wherever they found him. After eating and sleeping briefly, they set off after him like wild beasts. They knew that, on Gratian's orders, he had returned to Thrace and, after fortifying himself in Berea, was monitoring the suspicious course of events. To carry out their plan, they moved as quickly as possible. And he, skilled in commanding and sparing his soldiers, having anticipated the enemy's intentions, or more precisely, having been informed by reports from the scouts he had sent out, returned through the high mountains and dense forests to Illyricum. An unforeseen event brought him great success. Moving slowly forward in his retreat and leading his troops in a wedge formation, he encountered the Gothic prince Farnobius, who was carelessly roaming with his marauding bands and leading with him the Typhali, recently accepted into their alliance. The Taphals, if it is worth mentioning, when our people scattered in fear at the sight of the unknown peoples, crossed the river to plunder the places abandoned by the defenders. He, being a very careful commander, as soon as he saw them, began to prepare for battle and attack the looters from both tribes, who represented a formidable force. He could have destroyed them to the last man, so that not even a messenger of this defeat would remain. But after most of the people had fallen, including Farnobius, who had previously been a terrible instigator of evil deeds, Frigeric accepted the pleas of the survivors and spared them. They were resettled in the Italian cities of Mutina, Rhegium, and Parma, and given land to cultivate. It is said of the Taphals that this unfaithful tribe has defiled itself with filthy vices, so that among them men enter into unnatural relations with young men, and thus their youth is spent in such shameful intercourse. If any of the latter, after reaching manhood, catches a wild boar or kills a large bear on his own, he is freed from this unnatural filth. Such storms ravaged Thrace when that unfortunate autumn was already turning into winter. At the same time, Valens finally left Antioch and, after a long journey, arrived in Constantinople. His stay there lasted only a few days, and he had nothing but trouble because of the people's rebellion. The overall command of the infantry was given to Sebastian, a very astute general who had recently been sent from Italy at his request. This post had previously been held by Trajan. Valens himself went to the imperial villa in Melanthiada, where he tried to win over the soldiers by giving them property, provisions, and many flattering speeches. He announced a campaign by order and moved to Nika, a military post. There, from reports from scouts, he learned that barbarians laden with rich booty were returning from the Rhodope region to the outskirts of Adrianople. When the barbarians learned of the emperor's campaign with a large army, they hurried to join their compatriots, who had fortified themselves near Beroia and Nicopolis. In order not to miss this opportunity, Sebastian received orders to select 300 men from each detachment and to depart for there as quickly as possible to accomplish the task he had promised to perform for the state. When he approached Adrianople with a forced march, the gates were closed and he was not allowed to enter the city. The garrisons feared that he had been taken prisoner and was now playing a false role, but in fact was trying to carry out some disastrous deed for the city. When they finally recognized Sebastian, albeit late, and led him into the city, he fed the soldiers and gave them a rest as much as possible. In the morning they set off for the secret attack. The day was already drawing to a close when he suddenly saw the Gothic raiding parties near the Hebrus River, under the cover of hills and vegetation. He waited for some time, and late at night, keeping as quiet as possible, He attacked the enemies who had failed to form their ranks. He inflicted such a defeat on the Goths that he killed almost all of them, except for a few who escaped thanks to their swiftness, and took from them a huge amount of booty, which could not fit either in the city or in the spacious plain. Fritigern was greatly impressed by this and feared that this commander, who was known for his swiftness of action, might destroy the scattered Gothic troops engaged in plundering with unexpected attacks. He ordered everyone to retreat and quickly withdrew to the city of Kabyle, so that the Goths on the plain would suffer neither from hunger nor from secret ambushes. While things were developing in this way in Thrace, Gratian, after informing his uncle of how well he had dealt with the Alemanni, sent the baggage train and luggage ahead by land, while he himself set off with a light detachment along the Danube and arrived in Sirmium via Bononia. After resting for 4 days, even though he was suffering from a recurring fever, he set off down the Danube to Castro Martis. During this journey, he was suddenly attacked by the Alans and suffered some losses in personnel. Intelligence reports revealed that the enemy was attempting to block the road used to transport supplies to the army with strong guard posts. Appropriate measures were immediately taken to counter these attempts. To hold them back, a detachment of cavalry and foot archers was quickly sent to the nearest passes. Over the next 3 days, the barbarians advanced slowly, fearing they would be attacked in the pass from side paths. 15 miles from the city, they headed for the fortress of Nicaea. Due to an inexplicable mistake, our light vanguard estimated the number of all these hordes they saw at 10,000, and the emperor rushed against them with feverish haste. Advancing in battle formation, he approached Adrianople. There he built a fortified camp with a fence and a moat, eagerly awaiting Gratian, from whom he soon received a letter brought by the comet of the domestics, Rihamer, in which he wrote that he was arriving immediately. Gratian begged him in his letter to wait a little for his comrade in danger and not to rush blindly into it alone. Valens summoned all his dignitaries to a council to decide what to do. Like Sebastian, some insisted on attacking immediately, but the master of the cavalry, Victor, although of Sarmatian origin, but a calm and cautious man, expressed an opinion, which was supported by others, that they should wait for the co-emperor and, with the help of the Gallic troops, it would be easier to defeat the barbarians, who were inflamed by their high opinion of their own strength. But the emperor's stubbornness prevailed, as did the false opinion of some courtiers who advised acting with the utmost speed so as not to allow Gratian to participate in the victory, as they imagined it. While they were preparing for the decisive battle, a Christian presbyter sent by Fritigern, as they call him, arrived at the emperor's camp, along with other people of low rank. Received kindly, he delivered a letter from his leader, who openly requested that he and his people, who had been driven from their land by the bold aggression of the savage nations, be given the whole of Thrace with all its livestock and grain to settle. If his demands were met, he swore eternal peace. In addition, this Christian, as a faithful man initiated into the secrets of Fritigern, delivered another letter, only for the ruler. Skilled in cunning and various deceptions, Fritigern informed Valens, as a man who was soon to become his friend and ally, that he could not restrain the anger of his compatriots and persuade them to accept conditions favorable to the Roman state. In other words, if the emperor soon came against them with his armed army, the fear inspired by his name would deprive them of their deadly fighting spirit. The embassy, so ambiguous, was sent away without an answer. The next day, which according to the calendar was August 9th, at dawn the army was quickly sent forward, and the wagons and baggage were stored under the walls of Adrianople with a guard of legionaries. The treasury and the various insignia of the imperial office, the prefect, and the members of the consistory were taken inside the fortress. They walked along quite rocky and uneven roads, and the hot day was approaching noon. At the end of the 8th hour from the start, i.e., around 2 p.m., they saw the enemy's wagons, which, according to intelligence reports, were arranged in a circle. The barbarians, as was their custom, let out a wild and ominous cry, while the Roman commanders set about forming the battle lines of the army. The right wing of the cavalry was brought forward, while a large part of the infantry was left behind in reserve. The left wing of the cavalry was formed with great difficulty, as most of its units were still scattered along the roads and were now galloping lightly. While this wing was stretched out without encountering any opposition, the barbarians were terrified by the terrible clanging of weapons and the threatening blows of shields against each other, as part of their troops under Aliphi and Sapphic were still far away and, although they had been summoned, had not yet returned. And they sent negotiators to ask for peace. Because of their simple appearance, the emperor treated them with contempt and, in order to conclude a treaty, demanded that suitable officials come. The Goths deliberately delayed so that during this deceptive truce their cavalry, which they were expecting at any moment, could arrive, while on the other hand, the soldiers, exhausted by the summer heat, began to die of thirst at the very moment when the wide plain was ablaze with fires. Throwing wood and other dry material, the enemies lit fires everywhere. Added to this disaster was another serious circumstance, that both men and horses were tormented by terrible hunger. However, Fritigern cunningly analyzed all possible options, fearing a change in military fortune, and sent a simple Goth as a negotiator on his behalf with a request to send him, as quickly as possible, selected hostages and guarantees that he would resist the threats of his tribesmen and the inevitable consequences. This proposal, which inspired fear, met with approval from the tribune Aquitius, a relative of Valens, who was then in charge of the palace, and he was ordered by common consent to go immediately to the Goths as a hostage. But he began to resist, as he had already been captured by them and managed to escape to Dibal, and he feared that the Goths would be offended. Richomer himself offered his services and declared that he was ready to go, considering such a choice worthy and appropriate for a brave man. And so he departed, displaying the dignity of his position and origin. He was already approaching the enemy trench when the archers and shield bearers, who were under the command of the Iberians Becurius and Cassius, overcome by thirst, rushed forward and engaged the enemy in battle. But just as they had rushed forward untimely, so they disgraced the beginning of the battle with their cowardly retreat. This untimely attempt stopped the bold decision of Richomer, who was no longer allowed to continue. Meanwhile, the Gothic cavalry, led by Aliphi and Sapphic, returned together with a detachment of Alans. It appeared like lightning from the high hills and rushed into a swift attack, sweeping away everything in its path. From all directions came the clang of weapons and the whistling of arrows. The goddess of war, Bellona, raged fiercely beyond the usual measure, shouting a battle cry for the destruction of the Romans. Our men began to retreat, but they resisted again when they heard cries of resistance from many mouths. The battle raged like a fire, and terror seized the soldiers when several men at once were pierced by spears and arrows. Finally, the two battle formations collided like ship's prows and pressed against each other like waves with mutual movements. The left wing reached the camp of wagons and, if it had been given assistance, could have continued forward. But it was not supported by the rest of the cavalry, and the enemy launched a powerful attack, splitting it like a huge rock and repelling it. Thus, the infantry found itself without cover, and the manipules were so close to each other that it was difficult to swing swords and raise arms. The sky was not visible through the clouds of dust that rose, reflecting the threatening cries. Arrows flying from all sides, carrying death, always hit their target and wounded because it was impossible to see or avoid them. When the barbarian troops, bringing misfortune, began to turn their horses and men back, in this terrible narrowness, it was impossible to make room for retreat, and the crush took away any possibility of withdrawal. Our men desperately grabbed their swords again and began to cut down the enemy, and the mutual blows of axes split helmets and armor. Barbarians could be seen with faces contorted with fierce malice, with severed hamstrings, with severed right arms or torn shoulders. their fierce eyes rolling wildly on the very threshold of death. Enemies clinging to each other as they fell to the ground. The plain completely covered with corpses strewn across the ground. Everywhere, the moans of the dying and mortally wounded rang out, causing terror. In this terrible turmoil, the infantrymen, exhausted by tension and danger, having no strength or skill left to know what to do, and with most of their spears broken from constant blows, began to throw themselves against the dense ranks of the enemy with only their swords, no longer thinking of their salvation, seeing no possibility of escape. And since the ground, soaked with rivers of blood, made every step they took a misstep, they tried to sell their lives as dearly as possible and with such ferocity that some died from friendly fire. Everything around was covered in black blood, and wherever one looked, there were piles of dead bodies, and one's feet constantly stumbled over dead bodies. The sun, already high in the sky and past the constellation Leo, was heading toward the dwelling place of the Heavenly Virgin, burning the Romans, exhausted from thirst and hunger, weighed down by the burden of their weapons. Finally, under the pressure of the barbarians' forces, our battle line completely broke down and the people resorted to the last resort in such a hopeless situation. They fled in panic, each in a different direction. While everyone fled along unfamiliar paths, amid all this horror, the emperor fled the battlefield, moving with difficulty through the corpses toward the spearmen and shield bearers, who stood like a wall as long as they could hold back the enemy's numerical superiority. When he saw him, Trajan shouted that there would be no hope of salvation unless some help was called to defend the emperor, who had been abandoned by his armor-bearers. When the comitatus Victor heard these cries, he rushed to the Batavi, who were left nearby in reserve, to call them immediately to guard the emperor. But he could not find anyone there and fled the battlefield himself. In the same way, Richomer and Saturninus also escaped from danger. With lightning flashing from their eyes, the barbarians pressed against our men, whose blood was already cooling in their veins. Some fell, no one knowing whose blow had struck them. Others were knocked down by the weight of those coming, and some died from the blows of their own soldiers. The barbarians crushed all resistance and spared none of those who surrendered. In addition, the roads were blocked by numerous half-dead people moaning in pain and suffering from their wounds, and along with them, the plain was littered with piles of slaughtered horses among the people. These irreparable losses, which had so terribly befallen the Roman state, were ended by nightfall, dark and without a single ray of moonlight. Late at night, the emperor, who had fallen among ordinary soldiers, as can be assumed because no one confirmed that they had seen this themselves, or had fallen, mortally wounded by an arrow, soon died. In any case, his body was never found. Since groups of barbarians roamed these places for a long time to rob the dead, none of the escaped soldiers or local residents dared to show up there. A similar unfortunate fate, as is well known, befell Caesar Decius, who, in a fierce battle with the barbarians, fell to the ground from his maddened horse after failing to hold on to it. Falling into a swamp, he could not get out of it, and it was impossible to find his body. Others say that Valens did not die immediately, but that several senior soldiers and eunuchs carried him to a nearby wooden hut and hid him well on a well-built second floor. While they were trying to bandage him with their inexperienced hands, the hut was surrounded by enemies who did not know who was inside. This saved him from shameful captivity. When they tried to break down the locked doors and began shooting at them from above, not wanting to delay here in the face of opportunities to loot, they piled up bundles of dry reeds and wood, lit a fire, and burned the building along with the people inside. One of the senior soldiers jumped out of the window, but was captured by the barbarians. His confession of what had actually happened threw the barbarians into great disappointment, as they had deprived themselves of the great glory of capturing the ruler of the Roman state alive. This same young man, who secretly returned to our side after some time, recounted this event. Such a death befell one of the Scipionians during the conquest of Spain, who, as is well known, burned to death in a tower set on fire by the enemy, in which he was hiding. In any case, it is clear that neither Scipio nor Valens received the last honors of burial. Among the large number of high-ranking officials who died in this battle, Trajan and Sebastian should be mentioned first. Along with them, 35 tribunes commanding the legions and those free from command. Also Valerian and Equitius fell. The former was in charge of the imperial stables, and the latter ruled the palace. Among the fallen tribunes was Promotus Pretentious, still very young but universally respected. Because of his excellent qualities, the merits of his father Urzicin, a former master of the army, were also enhanced. As is well known, only a third of the army survived. According to the chronicles, only the Battle of Cannae was as bloody as this one. Thus died Valens, at about 50 years of age and after almost 14 years of reign. When, after this battle, night spread its darkness over the land, the survivors rushed, some to the right, others to the left, wherever fear drove them, searching for their loved ones. The darkness made it impossible to see even a step ahead, and it seemed to all of them that the enemy's sword was raised above their heads. Behind them, they could hear the pitiful moans of the abandoned, the gasps of the dying, and the grief wrung from the cries of the wounded. At dawn the next day, the victors, like wild beasts aroused by the taste of blood, rushed in dense crowds toward Adrianople. They were excited by vain hopes of taking the city, and they were completely confident that they would succeed. They knew from fugitives that the most distinguished dignitaries were there, as in a strong fortress, and that the insignia of the imperial office and the treasury of Valens were hidden there. Without allowing the general excitement to subside, on the fourth day, they surrounded the city on all sides, and a fierce battle began. The besiegers, with their innate ferocity, boldly rushed to their doom, while the besieged gave all their strength and showed bravery in their defense. Since a significant number of soldiers and cavalrymen were unable to enter the city, they were pressed against the walls, crowded into the adjacent buildings, and fought bravely from there until the 9th hour of the day. At that moment, 300 of our infantrymen, from those on the battlements themselves, built in a wedge formation, defected to the side of the barbarians. But those rushed upon them, for some unknown reason, and killed them all. This had an impact in the sense that later, even in the most desperate situation, no one dared to do anything similar. After so many disasters that were so depressing for us, a terrible storm suddenly broke out from the dark clouds, which scattered the barbarian troops pressing in from all sides. After returning to their wagons, arranged in a circle, they acted even more boldly. They sent our people a threatening letter demanding that they surrender and that the messenger's life be spared. But their messenger did not dare to enter, and a Christian brought and read the letter. This proposal was treated as it deserved. The rest of the day and the following night were spent preparing defenses. The gates were blocked from the inside with huge stones. The weak points of the fortress were reinforced. Facilities were set up in all directions that were convenient for shooting arrows and stones, and sufficient quantities of water were brought in everywhere, as many were tormented by thirst before the upcoming battles to the point of death. For their part, the Goths, realizing the dangerous change in military fortune, alarmed by the sight of wounded and slain warriors falling before their eyes and their forces gradually weakening, devised a cunning plan, which was revealed with the help of the goddess of justice. They persuaded several of our senior soldiers, who had previously defected to their side, to pretend to be fugitives, return, and pretend to be allowed into the city, and then, once inside, set fire to one end of the city. The fire was to serve as a signal for them to rush into the unprotected city while the population was fighting to extinguish the fire. With this agreement, the soldiers set off. When they reached the defensive moat, they raised their hands and begged to be accepted, as they were Romans. And indeed, they were let in because they did not arouse any suspicion that would prevent them from doing so. But when they were questioned about the enemy's intentions, they began to say different things. Because of this, they were subjected to interrogation. Their purpose for coming was discovered, and they were executed by beheading. on our side. All preparations for battle were made, and during the third night watch, the barbarians, forgetting their fear of recent losses, rushed in dense ranks toward the closed approaches to the city. Their commanders showed increasing stubbornness, but along with the soldiers, the provincials and palace servants joined in repelling the enemy, so that the multitude of attacking weapons of all kinds, thrown even without aim, did not fall without causing harm. Our men noticed that the barbarians were using the same arrows that were being fired at them. Therefore, it was ordered that before an arrow was shot from a bow, a deep cut should be made in the wood above the iron tip. This way, the arrows didn't lose their power in flight and kept all their force when they hit a body, but if they landed on empty ground, they broke right away. In the heat of battle, a totally unexpected event made a big impression. The scorpion, a type of cannon, which in simple terms was called a wild donkey, positioned opposite the enemy hordes, threw a huge stone. Although it did not hit anyone when it fell to the ground, its appearance caused such terror that the barbarians retreated before this new sight and were ready to withdraw completely. However, their commander ordered the trumpets to sound again, and the battle resumed. But the Romans had already gained the upper hand, for now no projectile or stone from a sling flew in vain. The Gothic commanders, excited by the ardent desire to seize the riches that Valens had obtained unlawfully, stood in the front ranks themselves, and the rest joined them. And in the city they realized that the dangers came from these leaders. Many fell mortally wounded, crushed by enormous weights or with their chests pierced. Others carried ladders and tried to climb the walls from all sides, but stones, pieces of columns, and entire blocks fell vertically on them and buried them. The horrific sight of blood had no effect on the barbarians who had come to a frenzy, and until dusk they showed wild bravery. Their excitement was also sustained by the fact that many defenders were killed by their deadly shots, and seeing this from afar, they shouted joyfully. Thus, with great excitement, the fighting continued in front of and behind the walls. But the battle proceeded without any plan, haphazardly and in separate groups, which showed complete disarray. When the day began to fade, everyone returned dejectedly to their tents, reproaching each other for the senseless madness of agreeing to the terrible assault despite Fritigern's advice.